Chapter 14. At 7 o'clock the next evening, everything was ready. They rounded the lighthouse at 10 minutes past 7, just as the beacon was being lit. The sea was calm and there was a fresh wind blowing from the southeast. By 5 o'clock the next evening, the Isle of Monte Cristo was clearly visible. They landed at 10 o'clock. The Jeune Amélie was the first to arrive at the rendezvous. Despite his usual self-control, Dantes could not restrain himself. He rushed ashore before any of the others and would have kissed the earth if he had dared. But it would have been useless to begin his search at night, so he regretfully put it off until the next day. Besides, a signal from half a league out to sea, which the Jeune Amélie answered by a similar signal, had just indicated that it was time to get to work. The latecomer, reassured by the signal, soon appeared, white and silent as a ghost, and dropped anchor a short distance offshore. Then the work of unloading the cargo began. As he worked, Dantes thought of the shouts of joy he would draw from all those men if he were to tell them of the thought with which his mind was constantly filled. Wait, I have to silence my phone. No one suspected anything, however, and when he took a gun the next morning and announced his intention of going off to shoot one of the wild goats which could be seen leaping from rock to rock, his exertion was attributed only to either a love of hunting or a desire of solitude. Jacopo was the only one who insisted on going with him, and Dantes was afraid to oppose him lest he arouse some suspicion. But he managed to kill a goat before they had gone a quarter of a league and sent Jacopo to carry it back to his companions, inviting them to cook it and signal him when it was done by firing a shot into the air. Dantes continued on his way, looking back from time to time until he finally reached the spot where he supposed the caves to be. Examining everything with meticulous attention, he noticed that on several rocks there were notches which had apparently been made by the hand of man. They seemed to have been cut with a certain regularity, probably to indicate a trail. These signs gave Dantes hope. Why could they not have been carved by the cardinal in order to guide his nephew? He followed them until they stopped. But they had taken him to no cave. A large round rock perched on a solid base seemed to be the only goal to which they led. It occurred to him that, instead of being at the end of the trail, he was at the beginning. He turned and retraced his steps. So he found like these man-made kind of notches, these man-made sort of hints, and he followed them. However, it led him more to the beginning instead of the end, and so he had to go completely the other way. But again, he's really trying to find his treasure, no? Meanwhile, his companions had finished cooking the goat. Just as they were taking it off the improvised spit, they saw Dantes leaping from rock to rock. They fired a shot to signal to him. He changed direction and came running toward them, but as they were all watching him, his foot slipped, and they saw him stagger on the edge of a rock and disappear. They all rushed forward at once, for they all loved Dantes despite his superiority. They found him bleeding and almost unconscious. He had apparently fallen from a height of 12 to 15 feet. They poured some rum down his throat, and he soon opened his eyes, complaining of a sharp pain in his knee, a feeling of heaviness in his head, and unbearable twinges of pain in his back. They tried to carry him to the shore, but as soon as they touched him, he groaned and said he did not feel strong enough to continue. The captain, who was obliged to leave that same morning, insisted that they try to get him on board the ship, but Dantes declared that he would rather die where he was than suffer the atrocious pain which so much movement would inflict on him. Just leave me a supply of biscuits, a gun to hunt with, and a pickaxe to build some sort of shelter with, in case you should be delayed in coming back for me, he said. But you'll starve, said the captain. We'll be gone at least a week. Listen, Captain, said Jacopo. Here's the answer to the problem. I'll stay here with you and take care of him. Do you mean you'd give up your share of the profit in order to stay with me? Asked Dantes. Yes, replied Jacopo, and without regret. "You're a good friend, Jacopo," said Dantes, "and God will reward you for your goodwill. But I don't need anyone. A day or two of rest will put me back on my feet." He shook Jacopo's hand affectionately, but his resolution to stay and stay alone remained unshakable. The smugglers finally gave him the things he had requested and left him. Okay, so Dantes supposedly, as soon as he found kind of like the pathway to the cave, no, he kind of supposedly got injured. Okay, he fell off a cliff and he's too injured to get back on the boat, and he just said, "Just leave me here. I'll be fine in a few days, and then I can take care of myself. Just come back for me in a week." Okay. Jacopo wanted to stay with him, but Dantes really said, "No, I'll really be fine on my own." An hour later, the little ship was almost out of sight. Then Dantes stood up, as agile and light on his feet as one of the wild goats of the island, took his gun in one hand and his pickaxe in the other, and ran toward the rock at which the trail of notches ended. "Now," he exclaimed, thinking of the story of the Arabian fisherman which Faria had told him, "Open sesame." After following the trail of notches in the opposite direction, Dantes found that it led to a little creek which was wide enough at the mouth and deep enough at the center to enable a boat to enter it and remain hidden. He deduced that the cardinal, not wishing to be seen, had landed at that creek, hidden his boat in it, then followed the line marked out by the notches, and at the end of the line buried his treasure. It was this supposition that led him back to the large circular rock. But there was one thing which upset his whole theory. The rock must weigh at least 2 or 3 tons. How could the cardinal have hoisted it up to the base on which it rested? Suddenly an idea occurred to him. Perhaps instead of being raised, it had been lowered. He climbed above the rock to search for its original resting place. He soon discovered that a slope had been made. The rock had slid down it to its present position, where it had been fixed in place by another rock about the size of an ordinary building stone, which had been used as a wedge. Dantes chopped down an olive tree, cut off its branches, and tried to pry up the rock with a trunk. But the rock was so heavy and was held so firmly in place by the rock wedge beneath it that no human strength could have budged it. He reflected for a moment and decided that he would have to direct his efforts against the wedge. He looked around him. His eyes fell on the powder horn his friend Jacopo had left him. With his pickaxe, he carved out a long hole between the large rock and the wedge and filled it with gunpowder. He then made a fuse by tearing a strip of cloth from his handkerchief and rolling it up with powder inside it. He lighted the fuse and ran back. The explosion was not long in coming. The upper rock was lifted from its base for an instant by the tremendous force, and the rock wedge beneath it was shattered into 1,000 pieces. So he's trying to get in the cave, by destroying this huge rock that's blocking the entrance. Dantes came back to the spot. The upper rock, now almost without support, was hanging over the cliff. He walked around it, chose the loosest spot, placed his tree trunk in a crevice, and began to pry with all his might. The rock tottered, then finally gave way completely and tumbled headlong into the sea. In doing so, it revealed a square stone with an iron ring set in the middle of it. Dantes uttered a cry of surprise and joy. His legs trembled so violently and his heart beat so wildly that he was obliged to stop for a moment. Then he put his lever through the iron ring and lifted vigorously, displacing the square stone. Beneath it, he saw a steep staircase leading down into the dark depths of a cave. Anyone else would have rushed forward with a shout of joy. Dantes stood doubtfully and turned pale. "I mustn't let myself be shattered by disappointment," he said to himself, "or else all my suffering will have been in vain." He then began to climb down into the cave with a smile of doubt on his lips, murmuring that ultimate word of human wisdom, "Perhaps." After he had been in the cave for a few seconds, his eyes, accustomed as they were to seeing in the dark, were able to penetrate into every corner. The walls of the wave were of granite. He recalled the words of the cardinal's letter in the furthest corner of the second opening. He had found only the first cave. Now he must search for the second one. So he entered a cave, but then there is another hidden cave that he has to find. He sounded the wall with his pickaxe. At length, he found a spot where the granite gave forth a hollower and deeper sound. He struck it again more vigorously. This time he noticed something strange. His blow had chipped a sort of plaster off the wall, revealing a softer grayish stone beneath it. The opening on the granite wall had been sealed up with another kind of stone and then covered over with its plaster, on the surface of which the appearance of granite had been imitated. He struck the stone with the sharp end of his pickaxe. It penetrated to a depth of about 1 inch. Dantes went to work. After some time, he noticed that the stones had not been cemented together, but simply piled on top of one another and covered with a layer of plaster. He shoved the point of his pickaxe into one of the interstices, pushed down on the handle, and to his great joy, one of the stones fell at his feet. From then on, he had only to pull each stone toward him with his pickaxe. Finally, after hesitating once again for several seconds, he entered the second cave. It was as empty as the first. So the first cave he entered was empty, and then he found a hidden cave. Inside that cave, it's still empty. It was as empty as the first. The treasure, if it existed, was buried in the furthest corner. The hour of anguish had arrived. 2 feet of earth was all that lay between Dantes and supreme joy or supreme despair. He walked over to the corner and, as though seized by a sudden resolution, energetically attacked the ground. At the 5th or 6th blow, his pickaxe struck metal. He struck a little to one side of the spot. He still encouraged resistance, but not the same sound. "It's a wooden chest bound with iron," he said to himself. Just then, a passing shadow cut off the daylight for an instant. Dantes dropped his pickaxe, picked up his rifle, and rushed out of the cave. A wild goat had leaped over the entrance to the first cave and was grazing a few feet away from the remaining flames of the fire, over which the smugglers had cooked their goat, and came back to the cave with his torch. He did not want to lose a single detail of what he was going to see. He held his torch up to the small excavation he had made and saw that he was not mistaken. His blows had struck wood and metal. He planted the torch in the ground and went on with his work. A short time later, he had cleared away a space about 3 feet long and 2 feet wide, and could clearly see an oaken chest bound with wrought iron. In the middle of the lid, on a silver plaque, were the arms of the Spada family, which Dantes easily recognized, for Faria had drawn them for him countless times. It was impossible to doubt it now. The treasure was there. No one would have taken such precautions in order to put an empty chest back in place. Dantes rapidly cleared away the earth around the chest. Soon the center lock appeared, then the handles at each end, all delicately wrought in the manner of that period when art made precious even the basest of metals. He took the chest by the 2 handles and tried to lift it, but it was impossible. He tried to open it. It was locked. He inserted the sharp end of the pickaxe between the chest and the lid and pushed down on the handle. The lid creaked, then flew open. Dantes was seized with a sort of giddy fever. He cocked his gun and placed it beside him. Then he closed his eyes like a child, opened them, and stood dumbfounded. The chest was divided into 3 compartments. In the first were shining gold coins. In the second, unpolished gold ingots packed in orderly stacks. From the third compartment, which was half full, Dantes picked up handfuls of diamonds, pearls, and rubies. As they fell through his fingers in a glittering cascade, they gave forth the sound of hail beating against the window panes. After he had touched them, fingered them, and buried his trembling hands in the gold and precious stones, Dantes ran out of the cave with the wild exultation of a man who has come to the brink of madness. He climbed up on a rock from which he could see the surrounding sea. He was alone, all alone with those incalculable, unheard of, fabulous riches which belonged to him. But was he dreaming or waking? He needed to see his gold again, yet he felt that, for the moment, he did not have the strength to look at it. He pressed his head between his hands for an instant, as though to prevent his reason from escaping. Then he began to run frenziedly around the island, frightening the wild goats and seagulls with his shouts and gesticulations. Then he returned, still doubting his senses, rushed into the cave, and found himself once again in the presence of his mine of gold and jewels. This time he fell to his knees, convulsively pressed his hands over his pounding heart, and uttered a prayer that was intelligible to God alone. And so Dantes finds his treasure, no? Finds the treasure. Oh man! What a nice feeling. Chapter 15. The next day, Dantes filled his pockets with precious stones, carefully buried the chest again, and disguised the entrance to the cave until no trace of it was visible. Then he began to wait impatiently for his companions to return. He had no desire to stay on the island looking at his gold and diamonds like a dragon guarding a useless treasure. It was time for him to go back among men and take up the rank, influence, and power which great wealth gives in this world. The smugglers returned on the 6th day. Dantes recognized the Jeune Amélie from a distance and dragged himself down to the shore. When his companions landed, he told them that although he was still in pain, he was considerably better. Then he listened to the account of their adventures. Their trip had been successful, and all of them, especially Jacopo, regretted that Dantes had been unable to take part in it in order to have his share of the profits, which would have been 50 piastres. Dantes managed not to smile at this. Since the Jeune Amélie had come to Monte Cristo only for him, he boarded her that evening and went on to Leghorn. In Leghorn, he sold 4 of his smallest diamonds for 5,000 francs each. The next day, he bought a small ship for Jacopo, adding 100 piastres to the gift to enable him to hire a crew, on condition that Jacopo go to Marseille and ask for news of an old man named Louis Dantes and a young woman called Mercedes. Jacopo thought he must be dreaming. Dantes told him that he had become a sailor only on a youthful impulse, and that upon arriving in Leghorn, he had received an inheritance from his uncle. Dantes' superior education made the story plausible, and Jacopo did not doubt its truth for an instant. The next day, Jacopo set sail for Marseille. He was to meet Dantes later at Monte Cristo. Okay, so right away, Dantes sold diamonds, got a ship, hired Jacopo to be his sailor and his assistant. Okay? That same day, Dantes took leave of the crew of the Jeune Amélie, giving each of them a handsome present and promising to let the captain hear from him. Dantes went to Genoa. The day of his arrival, he bought a small yacht, which had been ordered by an Englishman who had heard that the Genoese were the best shipbuilders of the Mediterranean. The Englishman had agreed to a price of 40,000 francs. Dantes offered 60,000 on condition that the yacht be turned over to him immediately. The shipbuilder offered to help Dantes engage a crew, but Dantes replied that he was in the habit of sailing alone and that the only thing he desired was that a secret compartment be built in the cabin. The compartment was finished the next day, and 2 hours later Dantes sailed out of the harbor of Genoa headed for the Isle of Monte Cristo. He arrived toward the end of the second day. His yacht was an excellent sailor and had covered the distance in 35 hours. The island was deserted. He went to his treasure and found it exactly as he had left it. By the next day, his immense fortune had been transferred to his yacht and locked up in the secret compartment. Dantes waited for 80 days, during which he maneuvered his yacht around the island, studying it as a horseman studies his mount. By the end of that time, he had recognized all its good qualities and all its defects. He promised himself to augment the former and remedy the latter. Jacopo arrived on the 8th day and tied up his small ship alongside Dantes' yacht. He had a sad answer to each of the two questions Dantes had asked. Old Louis Dantes was dead, and Mercedes had disappeared. Dantes' expression remained calm when he heard this news, but he immediately went ashore and refused to have anyone go with him. He returned 2 hours later. 2 sailors from Jacopo's crew came on board his yacht to help him sail it. He gave orders to head for Marseille. The news of his father's death was not unexpected. But what had become of Mercedes? There were also other things he wanted to know which he could trust no one else to find out for him. In Leghorn, his mirror had shown him that he ran no risk of being recognized. Furthermore, he had every means of disguise at his disposal. One morning, therefore, the yacht followed by Jacopo's ship boldly sailed into the harbor of Marseille and stopped opposite the very spot where Dantes had set out for the Chateau d'If. It was not without a certain anxiety that Dantes saw a gendarme coming out to meet him in the quarantine boat, but with the perfect self-assurance which he had acquired, he presented an English passport he had bought in Leghorn and went ashore without difficulty. So Dantes is back in Marseille, and this is actually where the story will really begin, guys, no? Because the Count of Monte Cristo, above all things, it is a revenge story, and it's about this once very innocent and kind man wanting revenge for the people who ruined his life, and now he has the treasure, now he's out of jail, and now he's ready to deliver some revenge, no? And so that's really the story of the Count of Monte Cristo. It's Dantes and his desire for revenge and what that's going to do to him good. Okay? And now we know, well, he found out his father died, which wasn't surprising to him, but the weird thing is that Mercedes disappeared. They don't know where Mercedes is, and Dantes is kind of wondering what happened to her. Okay, so click on the next video for chapter 16.